Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Ilmari, and thank you to all of you for being here on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. It's great to see you all. So I will be talking to you about climate change and democracy. And the idea is to think like, well, we have this very, very, very big problem on our hands, right? First of all, what can we do to it as democratic nations? And second of all, is democracy the right answer? Some people don't think so. But what is the role of philosophical and ethical arguments in such democratic debates then? So those are the kind of things I'll be looking at today. So let's get started. So climate change is a very, very complex problem, as all of you know. I mean, the scale is humongous. It's global. The amount of actors involved is pretty much everybody. We all contribute to climate change in some way, even if we don't want to. Then there's all these collective agents. We have the states, European Union, United Nations. We are looking for climate leadership from them, and we're not always getting the climate leadership we're looking for from collective agents. But it's also like, there's no uncertainty that climate change is human-made. There's no uncertainty that it's very bad. There's no uncertainty that we are on this, at the moment, getting the global average temperatures much higher than we can handle. So there's no uncertainty on any of that. But there's still we don't know how bad it's going to get, right? Because that's going to depend on what we're going to do or what we're not going to do. But there's just lots of unanswered questions there. It's not like a simple thing we can push some button and magically the problem is gone away. We have lots of questions we have to decide. And these include, for example, who is paying for the mitigation, adaptation, compensation? Should the rich nations who've been doing most of the polluting pay more? What about these right to development things? Should the countries that are only getting on board the emission thing now, should they be allowed to emit more, raising their citizens out of poverty, for example? And in what kind of speed should we be moving? Well, climate scientists will tell you, and I agree, that we should be moving at a very fast pace, but there's lots of people who are saying, there's all these other benefits that balance out the harms, and, maybe we should move slower. That's been the economic message for a long time, but that doesn't really hold anymore because, as we're seeing, the climate is getting quite unpredictable already, unfortunately. But anyway, it's a very, very complex thing, right? And what makes it even more complex when we're thinking about ordinary people like you and me, that most of our emissions, they're tied to infrastructure. So say that you're rich enough that you can afford to put solar panels on your roof and you're rich enough to own a house in the first place. That's great for the climate, but that's still not going to fix the problem on its own. And there are lots of these decisions that you just as an individual cannot directly influence, right? So, and that's the kind of things like how, for example, the schools and universities and libraries and other public facilities heated up in the place where you're living. In general, what is the energy infrastructure in the country that you're living? These are not kind of things that you can just go and change with your individual consumer behavior, although you can influence them, but to a small degree, and together we can influence them, but these are just things for politics, right? And the same thing goes how greenly you can move about in the place where you're living. So in Helsinki, here's a tram line. I hope you've gotten to jump on one of them during this time you've been here. But those kind of things are only possible if the local infrastructure supports those kinds of green choices. So you can't take public transportation to work or school if there's none. And then you have to take your car and be part of the emissions problem. So these kinds of things, these are joint issues that we have to decide together, and we have to decide them together, usually through the infrastructure, state, all these things. It's inevitable that we get these policy decisions when we look at climate change. So while I was saying that, it's very complex and everything, I started off the presentation with that, there's some simple part to the complexity, and that is that we burn too much fossil fuel and that we have to stop burning that much fossil fuel. So that's very simple in a sense. But again, all that burning is linked to our infrastructure. And it takes time and it takes joint decisions to change that infrastructure. And there's lots of people's jobs in line. But of course, then with green transition, there's new jobs. But again, these are like big, wide picture issues that have to be decided together. And then, of course, because the fossil fuel companies, they known about this for a long time, much longer than it became public knowledge. They knew about it already in the 80s, how bad the situation is going to become through their own scientists that looked at the emerging science back then. But they're, of course, very powerful players as well. So that's one of the reasons that the kind of democratic international process has been so slow so far. And a lot of decades have been wasted. They've been very, very, very strongly lobbying. A lot of the biggest players in fossil fuel industry, they're huge. And they also account for majority of the emissions. And of course then, you know, their products are used widely in society. So again, nothing is very simple when it comes to climate change. But at the same time, there is this kind of simple thing that this is what needs to change in the infrastructure, but there are very, very, very powerful you know, lobbying interests there as well that have been hindering the democratic processes. And there's a famous book, Emergence of Doubt, by Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway. They look at the history of what happened when climate science emerged. And there was initially this like alert. This was in the late 60s, early 70s, and definitely in the 80s. Like, for example, United States Senate, they were like going to act on it, and it wasn't this partisan issue at all. Republicans were just as worried as Democrats. But there was all this, like, then the fossil fuel industry really like kicked in and wanted to kind of stir the debate into like take it off that course of strong regulation to curb fossil fuels. So they have these many sophisticated and well-funded campaigns to discredit climate science. And this is still ongoing, and this is very, it hasn't gone anywhere, it's just taken different form. So now it's a bit more sophisticated. Again, it's, nobody's saying like that we couldn't trust the climate science. It's more like, you're always cherry picking the uncertainties and saying maybe need more time, maybe need more certainties. Or what has been happening in the last decades has been this whole like, look at your individual carbon footprint. That's what you should care about. This kind of like try to individualize this collective thing that then you kind of like, you again blur the debate. But this is really bad for democracy, right? Because if you're like exposed to misinformation or any kind of conspiracy theories or any of these things, it can affect your voting behavior. It can affect like how likely you're, for example, to take action to reduce emissions because you're thinking maybe this is not such a urgent issue or this has been an issue that has been like exaggerated or something. And this situation is worse in some countries than others. Like there is a lot of skepticism still in some countries, yeah, United States, and that's because it's been very much manufactured, this doubt, and they've been using the tobacco industry tactics to do this. So they've been actually taking the playbook from the PR industry and done the same thing as they did with tobacco and cancer. So these are like the kind of background things why this is like a complex thing for democracy, right? So some people are saying that this is too complex. Like, let's just like, and anyway, democratic, you know, it has, we can see that democracy has lots of problems anyway. We have all this disinformation, polarization, like we just don't get stuff done. We should like, let's just give up maybe on democracy. And we should have more like maybe, for example, epistocracy. There's a famous proponent of that from Jason Brennan, and he's saying like, let's have more like the experts, like, you know, in charge, and they'll tell us what to do, and then we can get like, we need to get moving on these issues, and then we actually get some action. So I will be saying that if we would actually have this shift towards this kind of more epistocratic governments that some people are suggesting we should have, I don't think that's actually going to help anything. I think it's just going to exaggerate the underlying problems, and I will be like talking about this during this lecture. And I think, of course, like the bigger problem with this kind of approach, it raises some serious issues of justification of like who gets to rule over whom, who is then the expert, like, well, what are the value choices? And what I'll be talking about soon is like that there's just lots of value choices. I told you some in the beginning already, like who should be doing how much and all these kinds of things. These are things that we need to decide together. There's not like, there's certain things we can find out about climate change by, you know, drilling hole in ice and looking how much carbon there is, their concentration. But there's a lot of things and how we're going to fix this problem that we have to talk together, debate, discuss. There's no like ready-made solutions for this thing. And that's why I think this is quite People might mean well, but this is a very dangerous route to take, in my opinion. And one of the reasons, if we go down this just kind of let's have the experts decide everything and they know the best route, it sounds kind of maybe appealing in some sense. And I want to say here a big, strong disclaimer, I am not against expertise. I think experts are very important. I think technocrats are very important. Like, you need them to keep the, the big collective wheels running, right? You need expertise. So I'm not saying anything about experts, right? I'm just saying that if the dream is like that we'll just have experts set out the climate policy and like we skip that messy democracy, that's not going to be good. And here's one example, like a historical example of why I don't think it's very good. And this comes from George Marshall's book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. But he's also looking at like kind of what happened at the very start when like the UN process started, right? When we started doing those first, like trying to get these global treaties off the ground. So, and he's been interviewing the people who were involved in this thing. So I think it's like psychologically quite an interesting chapter there. So what he's saying is that these decision makers and policy strategies drew on what they saw as precedents to climate change. So we had just gotten, so this was in the 80s, we had just gotten this binding treaty to deal with ozone layer depletion, like Montreal Treaty, right? And they thought, oh, another big problem with the atmosphere, right? Let's fix it in the same way. But the problem is that like ozone layer depletion, that's a bad problem. It was a big problem, but really tiny compared to climate change. Much more localized, much more easier to fix it, like let's get certain chemicals off the air, like, that was exactly the kind of thing you could like successfully get a treaty, like first there was alarm from the science, then there was this action, then things got much better, right? I mean, there were some bumps in the way on that story as well, but anyway, like that worked. But with climate change, so the technocrats was thinking like, oh, okay, that really worked. Let's do the same for climate change. That this is like a new problem. But this also meant that when you were having this bunch of experts thinking, so this is from the Marshall's book, so they were thinking like, okay, so this is like an environmental issue. We have another environmental problem, just like the ozone layer depletion. Whereas it's kind of very, very misleading to say climate change is an environmental problem. Sure, environment is involved, but it's also a resource problem. It's an energy problem. It's definitely an economic problem. It's a health problem, and it's a social rights issue, and it's just a much, much, much wider problem than people like kind of started thinking at that point. And then the same thinking just went like, well, let's have these. We should have this emissions trading, that's the best way to manage this. Whereas it probably would have been through regulation, taxation, rationing of fossil fuels, but these things were kind of left off table. And at this point, it wasn't because of the fossil fuel company lobbying. Of course, they've been keeping this up since then, but the original framing didn't come from there. It just literally came from this like thinking of, yeah, that's the solution, kind of. So there wasn't like, at least according to Marshall, there wasn't this initial thing like, let's get this whole treaty kind of to the wrong tracks to start off with. It was like, yeah, this is the solution, and there just wasn't enough maybe, I'm going to claim that there wasn't enough output from different epistemic sources. So what I argue about climate policy making in this book that I have just published earlier this year, Taking Responsibility for Climate Change, is that value choices are just simply inevitable, and because they're embedded in all the policy choices we make. So if we're trying to do like, let's just get the best brains together, or let's just get some technical solution, that's lovely, but it's just not going to work on its own. So we need those things as well. It's just not going to work on its own when it comes to climate change. And I'm going to say that these things need to be debated openly to get the climate policy right. And then ethics, they can highlight what is at stake and then ground these normative arguments in these public deliberations. So I will be giving you a detailed example why I don't think we can bypass ethics soon. But so these are like kind of my main points that I'm making in the chapter in the book where I'm talking about climate change and democracy. But let's get into them a bit more now. So here's another book on climate ethics and democracy. It's called Debating Climate Ethics. It came out, I think, in 2016. It's written by climate ethicist Stephen Gardiner and the legal theorist David Weisbach. So there are lots of people who are thinking that there's nothing ethical arguments have to give to this climate change debate. Actually, they're thinking that it might make things even worse. We're just going to get into a bigger mess, and we're just going to have even more roadblocks, and nothing's going to happen. So it's better to have a kind of narrower focus on climate ethics. Climate policy making. And here is my example is from David A. Weisbach, who is the legal theorist, and he suggests that self-interest in this book, it's an alternative to justice and ethics in climate policy. So he's basically saying just literally forget all this nonsense that philosophers have talked about justice and ethics or anybody else, but he's using philosophers as his examples because, he's writing this book together with a philosopher, so it's kind of a debate book. But he's saying we just need self-interest. If we're looking at what's in the self-interest of a nation, then we see what kind of climate policy is feasible, that, no nation is going to sign into a treaty that's against its self-interest. That's crazy. So we need to look at, and it's not the idea of this kind of, the idea is that he wants to get climate policy off the ground as well. He wants to see climate action. He's not against that. But he's just thinking that what we need to do is we look at the self-interest of that nation. In the negotiations, we look at something that we can give to that nation, then we kind of try to formulate it from that, right? So he's saying, to a great extent, if we are behaving in a way that is contrary to our own self-interest, we do not use or need ethics to tell us what to do. We don't say, stop hitting yourself in the head with a hammer. It's unethical. We say, stop hitting yourself with a hammer. You will hurt yourself. The appeal is purely to self-interest. So this is just when I read the book originally, this really struck me, this caption, because, of course, a lot of it is sophisticated discussion on climate policy and everything. And actually, I think when a lot of these things in debates, when people are discussing how should we do the climate policy, people are usually in agreement that we should have ambitious climate policy and we should take action on everything. But I think this is really, really, really telling, this idea that the idea is just stop hitting yourself with a hammer, right? And it's the same way we should approach climate policy. Ignore all that stupid ethics. So I'm going to call this the pure self-interest approach. And I think there's three, well, I'm sure there's lots of other problems, but I will focus on three problems with the pure self-interest approach. The first problem is importance of the context, okay? So maybe it's true that in certain contexts, what's in our self-interest, it's very obvious. It requires no debate or ethical considerations. And I think if this is so, definitely hitting yourself with a hammer, that seems to qualify, right? At least in my head, I can't come up with any plausible context where it would make sense for me to start hitting myself with a hammer. So I don't think you guys will need to tell me any ethical debates to stop hitting myself with a hammer. You can just say, you're going to get really hurt. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't think about it. Thanks for telling me. It's not in my self-interest. Okay. But how applicable is this in the context of climate change policy? I don't think at all. I'm really, maybe your imagination is wilder than mine, but I'm absolutely failing to see what's the relevance of hitting yourself with a hammer and hurting yourself. Sorry, not with a nail, yeah, hitting yourself with a hammer and hurting yourself and climate policy. I'm not really sure. Then the second one is this whole argument jumps straight from the individual level to the collective level. So we're having, this is in your self-interest not to hit yourself with the hammer, to we can come up with national and international policy based on self-interest. It's quite a large jump. It's maybe easier to tell what's in somebody's self-interest if we're talking about an individual person. But then when we're talking about, so even if we want to, so if we're talking about what's in the self-interest of a nation, for example. These are some of the terms that Weisbach is using. So he's talking about things like cost effectiveness, cost saving, avoiding significant job losses or trade disadvantages. These are all clearly things that are in the self-interest of a nation, right? Okay, but government policy that's about balancing different interests within a nation, right? It's not like, there's not many things. There's certain things, certainly like safety, that's in the interest of everybody within a nation, right? But most of the time, like politics is about like the certain amount of resources, how we're going to share them, like what we're going to do in general. You're trying to balance, and usually any policy decision is going to favor some and disfavor some other groups. So it's like trying to balance that thing. So it's not like we're already losing the stop hitting yourself with a hammer simplicity there, because you're kind of basically hitting some groups with a hammer and you are not hitting others with the hammer at all. You're giving them chocolate or something. So to balance these interests, we need politics in which ethics also come into the mix, because then the different options are debated. So then we are like looking at, oh, okay, so if we do this policy thing, these groups are going to get advantage. But hey, maybe we should do this instead, and these groups are the one who actually need it. Or there's this third option, and okay, we can maybe balance this thing better for everybody, and maybe there is some win-win option or something, you know. But anyway, this is just, it's just to show that how would you get self-interest in these kind of simplistic terms, even when you look at a nation, let alone like international or something. And then the third problem with this pure self-interest approach is that short-term and long-term self-interests are often in conflict. So say I would actually have a bunch of chocolate and I would give it to you now, and then there would be lots of other chocolate you would be getting for the next week or so or something. That would be maybe in your self-interest in the short term to eat all of that chocolate. I mean, I'm all for eating chocolate, but I just mean like eating tons and tons and tons of chocolate. That's maybe not in your long-term benefit for your health, right? And there's lots of things like maybe it's not in our short-term interest to be inside on such a sunny, lovely day. Maybe it is, but it's definitely in our long-term interest, right? There's just lots of things that we need to balance constantly about doing certain things that are going to benefit us in the future. And again, this is much more pronounced when we're looking at collective level, policy level things. And there's rarely a simple answer to what is in someone's self-interest, especially again when we're looking at the collective level policy decisions. So we must weigh the pros and cons, consider how the policy is likely to affect different interest groups and to what degree and so on. Also, the thing is like we can value things that are not in our self-interest. We can value things that are, for example, good for people that we care about, or we can value things that are good for the wider community. So all these things make it just very, very, very complex, I think, in my opinion, to just claim that we can just ignore values, we can ignore ethics, and we can just go with self-interest and make climate policy. I just think that's simplistic and naive. Okay, so what do we need normative arguments for then? I've kind of given the answer to you already, but I think the point is that, sure, go ahead and criticize philosophers, all the climate ethicists, as some of these commentators do, that you do not offer a comprehensive policy proposal. Yeah, I mean, my book, I'm very glad to tell all of you, I am not offering anybody a comprehensive policy proposals. I also don't think it's my role. I'm a philosopher, I'm an individual person. Why on earth should I be making policy proposals for a bunch of people? I think that's insane as well. So yeah, so if that's your standard for ethical theories, that you can't just, that's not kind of like a manual that you can read, oh, this is what I'm going to do. Yeah, you're going to be disappointed with them. That's not what ethical theories will be able to tell you, at least any good, realistic ethical theories. So I'm saying like now complex situations, right? Ethics can tell us things about what to do in individual relationships and stuff, but I'm now talking about complex climate policy decision making, right? But I still think they do have an important role in climate policy making. What is that role? They can highlight what values are at stake, and they can help ground normative arguments in public deliberations. So when we're trying to say, like, for example, if you do economic analysis and you have to do all this cost-benefit analysis and other things, and then you get some nice charts and figures, and this is all very important when you're doing policy decisions. You have to be able to evaluate things. You also have to be aware of the cost and the benefits, and you also have to be aware of monetary terms and stuff. But at the same time, there's always tons of assumptions that get kind of baked into those things. And if we just try to like ignore that there's all these assumptions there and nothing is chosen in kind of the modeling stage, then that's just illusion again. We have to be there's certain decisions we're going to be making, certain like things we're going to be leaving out whenever we're modeling anything, and then we have to just be open about it. And ethics can like really highlight like, okay, if we're making these decisions, these are some of the choices we're making. And ethical questions are just embedded in these policy choices. And then these choices should be, I think, in my opinion, like openly debated, right? But it's not the only thing. There's also, I think, a very important thing, which is that ethical arguments can also inspire new horizons of thought. And what I mean by my fancy horizons of thought is just that they can also give us like inspiration. They can like show us like, so okay, these are some of the values, these are some of the things we value together, these are some of the things we should value, maybe these are some of the things we haven't considered, maybe there's these other ways of being together, maybe this is other ways of organizing our lives, maybe there's these opportunities that we haven't seen yet. So they can also like, and there is like a long history of philosophers and other normative theories inspiring all kinds of political action and political movements throughout history. So where should these normative things go in there? I think in participatory democracy. So participatory democracy, I'll give you a concrete example very soon. This is the last part of my talk, just to give you a little bit more. We've been now in the very much in the ethics sphere and stuff, and this kind of very theoretical part. Let's come a little bit back to reality. So, not reality, I mean like to the nitty-gritty. So when we reason together by engaging in this open debate, all these, I told you about this kind of biases and like framing issues and other things we had when we had that, the first thing of how should the treaty on climate change look like at the UN level. So, but when we have a wider pool of people who are reasoning together with different kinds of epistemic strengths, viewpoints, cognitive abilities, we get, these things get challenged. We can challenge each other's biases and other kind of blind spots and other things. And empirical research suggests that groups reason better than individuals, as long as they're actually engaged in debate. And this debate should be genuine in the sense that the group members actually hold different kinds of views when they begin their debate. Because, because when you have different kinds of people, then you're better at countering these biases and kind of framing and kind of group think that you can like fall into if you're just talking with people who are already like-minded. And what happens when you have these participatory approaches, they expand the available policy inputs, and then you have a just more robust decision-making, and this applies to other things than just climate policy. You just have more input from different kinds of viewpoints in society. And these, there's people who've been like Helen Landemore, she's a famous political scientist, philosopher, who's like arguing that, we can, through participatory democracy, we have this emergence of collective intelligence as well. So here is that example that I promised you. This is the Irish Citizens' Assembly. It met between October 2016 and April 2018. They consisted of a chairperson, and then they had 99 Irish citizens. And they met over 12 weekends to discuss 5 policy issues, and one of them was climate change. And the idea was, the brief was, what should Ireland's climate policy look like? And at that point, Ireland had one of the least ambitious climate policies in Europe. And these 99 members of the Assembly, so this is just an example of how this kind of participatory thing is done. We can't like get all the Irish people together in one room. So what is done instead, they're chosen randomly, but at the same time that they're representing different ages, social classes, locations, and gender. So the idea is that they're really like a mini public that is kind of representative of who actually lives in Ireland. And then they get briefed by experts on these issues. There were other issues that they were discussing, so climate change was one of the 5. And then the members debate these issues in groups. And then they vote on what to recommend to a special parliamentary committee. And this was the good thing what Ireland did. So it wasn't just like, let's hear what our citizens have to say and then ignore that. It was like they actually put this special parliamentary committee together. They established it just to take forward these recommendations. And this also affected Ireland's policy on other issues as well. But I'm just focusing on the climate policy side. So they put together this report that was credited with significantly shaping Ireland's ambitious climate action plan, which was published in June 2019. So this actually had an impact. So one of the things, for example, like kind of wisdom within Irish politicians was that we can't go too far, that one of the things, for example, is like the farmers, there's a lot of farming going on, they will not support this kind of ambitious climate policy. But actually what happened is that the Citizens' Assembly was giving much more ambitious recommendations than the politicians thought. And then this thing actually passed into a law. And now Ireland has totally different kinds of climate policy. So this is just a practical example of how when you get citizens involved, it can actually change the political thinking and can have practical implications. So these deliberations within these mini-publics, they can reduce the partisan divisiveness and facilitates this kind of sophisticated reasoning that transfers values into policy preferences. So you're talking about values. They're talking about the values. They're like, so a farmer talks about somebody who's coming from a different viewpoint, and they talk about what's at stake. And the idea is to really try to come and see and respect the other person's point of view and come up with something new together. And this helps to counteract these misleading framings that I talked about earlier that can result from expert biases. So, and what I think is like, we shouldn't have this this takes a lot of time and resources, right? We shouldn't have this on every possible issue ever that a state has to decide. My suggestion is that we should have this kind of debate on decisions that come with novel value choices, and this is wider than climate ethics now, and these should be subjected to participatory deliberation. And I think this novelty can come either from rise of some new situations, so for example, a new technology, which we are seeing at the moment, for example, with artificial intelligence, or a kind of new configuration of circumstances. There's no clear precedence, we haven't been here before, how we're going to deal with this, which is very much like climate change as well. So then I think we need this kind of participatory. This is just now my own view. And I think then when we have this overall plan, right? Like for example in the Ireland case, we have the committee report on what do the citizens think the Irish climate policy should look like. Then I think the choices that trickle down from that overall policy, they can be decided by experts alone. We don't have the resources, we don't have the time to be involved in everything. And then there's just a lot of very technical decisions that trickle down from them, and that's fine. I think then we can just go for the expert, business as usual state machinery there. To give an example, once a region has decided to transition to a form of renewable energy, or for example, a region has decided to adopt carbon taxes, then I think these kind of details and technological fine-tuning can be done at the administrative expert level, but only as long as there's no new value choices that come up as part of the process. So in summary, I think we need better democracy to deal with climate change. I think climate technocracy needs deliberation and participatory democracy, not to only balance it, but also to correct these epistemic errors and bring these unique viewpoints to the table. I think maybe some people are saying I'm too optimistic. Maybe I am. I don't care. But I think this is better. And I do think ethics have a role in here, including philosophical arguments, because they can ground these normative claims, they can highlight what values are at stake, and importantly, they can also inspire these new horizons of thought. So thank you for your time.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Does anyone want to ask anything from Säde Hormio?
Thank you. That was a great lecture. I just have two questions. One, when you talk about climate ethics, you gave the analogy of the chocolate and the hammer, and I agree regarding climate policy, but when you see democratic nations are like developed democratic nations are dealing with climate change worse than developed monarchical nations. Like I would give the example of the UAE and the US regarding their net capita climate production, but we see that both of these are inherently successful countries. What's your opinion on that?
So can you give me because somebody was talking, just the example part at the end, I heard everything else.
So UAE as a country is a monarchy, but they have probably done more to deal with their net climate change output than probably the US. I know that the US is like extremely industrial, but if you see that both of these are developed, successful countries. So what is your opinion on the fact that monarchical nations are dealing with climate change better than democratic nations?
Yeah, great, thank you. So I think it's like, whoops, the jury is out on like what's the kind of most successful climate policy so far. So I'm definitely not saying that if you don't have democracy, you cannot deal with climate change successfully. So let's imagine that you have some like amazing leader, a queen in some country, and they will just like come up with the most ambitious climate policy ever. That's great. So that can really work. It's just usually what happens in countries with, say, for example, a lot of fossil fuels. So what happens to them is they usually fall into this like resource curse, because fossil fuels is one of these natural resources that can be really easily held by a small group of people. So you just need to really simplify it, you need some guns and some militia, and then you can hold the oil well. So this is very different than countries that have, say, natural resources like that makes it very good ground for example, having lot of wheat or something, everywhere, So a lot of these, the oil countries are autocratic as well. So that's the reason like they're not coming up with good climate policies. But you can have, non-democratic country, but it's just, I think it's just more, it's then more up to chance if that policy will be good or not. It's just up to that one ruler. So it's much more riskier if you're going down that route.
I just have one more question, sorry, this is in a different domain. So when you see developing nations right now, right, they have to invest a lot in their fossil fuel to develop their industry like developed nations did during the Industrial Revolution. So in the current scenario, why are we incentivized to punish the nations who are polluting more now? Shouldn't we give them the same amount of time we gave developed nations in the 1800s when they were polluting? Nobody calls them out for that, but we call out developing nations now, especially because they don't have the resources to develop renewable energy due to a low capita income. Yeah,
great. So this is exactly one of the big debates in climate ethics, right? In the kind of like, what is the, and also in the United Nations level, so what is the fair thing? And this is exactly what a lot of the representatives from countries that are still like, really like raising their living standards are saying, like, you guys did the pollution since the Industrial Revolution. Who are you to tell us that we can't do this now, right? So I think the solution there, and I think that is a bit hypocritical, but the solution there is to do this jump. We cannot afford to go to the fossil fuel industry route everywhere in the world. We just need to stop that very, very fast. We're like our carbon budget. We're out of time on that. But what we need to do, what developed nations need to do, is do technology transfers. So they need to give the blueprints for all the green energy solutions, right? And that needs to be scaled up really fast. And that needs to be like, so they can make this leap. So instead of start building coal plants, you build solar power or wind turbines or something like that. So that is the solution. And there's a lot of people who are arguing for this, and there's different kind of mechanisms that have been introduced as well. But I do think that's like literally the only solution, that we just have to do that technology transfer and a big jump. The positive thing is that in all these kind of projections of what's going to happen with renewable energy, what's actually happened the past 10 years has been much better than anybody predicted. And also, like some countries like China, it gets a lot of bad rep for all the pollution. They're also the world leader in renewable energy. Like the investments they put on solar and especially like wind energy, much, much bigger than United States, right? So China is actually leading on the green energy, even though it has lots of the pollution energy as well. But yeah, we need this green technology jump. Yeah.
Okay, we still have time for some questions, but please be respectful for the speaker and for the other listeners here. So please don't talk while someone else is speaking, all right?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting. I just had a question kind of maybe about more the practical aspects. And the first part would be about legitimacy. Like how can we, because what we currently have, you know, the national parliaments, they're like elected bodies and we trust them to make the decisions. But if it's a group of like 100 random people, you could say, what stops the other people who haven't gotten into this exclusive group from saying that, you know, what power do they have to decide our policy? So that would be one thing. And then the other would be kind of the implementation of these policy directions that the people decide. Because it seems that if the people don't go into details, which obviously they can't really because they're not experts, then that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. You know, you can say that we should do carbon taxes, but you can probably, you know, the devil's in the details, you can probably like manipulate that quite a lot. And how do you think our current public is engaged enough in political processes, and are they following it enough to like check these things and check that the stuff that people decide it's actually getting implemented in the way that they wanted it to be? Or do you think that more like active participation would be a result maybe of this participatory democracy, or do you think that it kind of has to come before for it to work?
Those are
Thank you.
excellent, great questions. So if I answer them in reverse order, so if I remember them all, like, okay, let's start off with the kind of, so the legitimacy, right? So yeah, that's why it's really important that this is properly tied to the parliamentary institutions, right? So in the Irish thing, it's a good example because so the decision came from the parliament to establish this, and then, you know, it's essentially lottery. It's like weighted lottery because you want to get all these different groups represented, but then that feeds back into the parliamentary process. So in the end, like, it is the elected people in the parliament who are responsible for those decisions. But I mean, there are more radical things, suggestions of how to do participative democracy. There's just tons of different kinds of suggestions how to do this. And one of them is, for example, that you should just have a lottery of people, like in general, that then those are the people who choose things for a while, for X amount of years, you know. I think, so yeah, so the things need to be carefully thought. It can never be just like, because otherwise people, can feel like, hey, who are you to tell me what to do? But at the same time, I don't think there has been any of that kind of feeling in Ireland, you know, because that is when it's a clear and fair procedure, right? Then it can be justified to others. And of course, like participatory thing can take form of more direct democracy. So like in Ecuador, they just decided this autumn that the national oil company has to stop drilling in the Amazon and leave those oil to the ground. And that was in a direct vote to the people. In terms of like, well, do they know enough about this stuff to be able to actually like make good decisions? And then the kind of chicken or the egg dilemma, like which comes first? I think they kind of go hand in hand. So like when people feel that they have a say, then they're more likely to get engaged in things. But we don't need to be, I think there's a huge epistemic challenges for being a citizen in the modern world, because there's just so much stuff happening all the time. And we're supposed to have decisions on everything. And then there's all this stuff that's kind of get thrown at us and in social media and everywhere. Like, am I supposed to know the solution to everything? No. So the idea is like, there's a certain level of kind of civil knowledge it would be good to have, like general knowledge as a citizen. But then when you're, for example, if you're one of the people who's taken in the lottery to be in this, and you agree, nobody forces you into these things, of course, then you are given a lot of background information. So it's almost like if you go in a course at high school and then you don't know much about it, but you learn about it during the thing, and then by the end of the course you can actually talk about it with much more certainty. So that's the idea, that you don't have to know everything about everything, but then be prepared to take part in the talk. I also think people know much more about stuff than they give themselves credit for, especially in something like climate change. We tend to think like, oh, there's all these fancy terms like IPCC and UNFCCC and like I don't know them, and how does it actually work, the carbon concentration, like we don't need to know all of that. It's super technical, right? But then you can also hide behind this thing and try to make it to like, this is what also a technique that people like decision makers use when they don't want people to question it, like just throw a bunch of like acronyms at you and like fancy technical terms and say, you don't understand, but I do, and they don't necessarily understand anything more than you. Because the thing is that if you really understand something, you have to be able to talk about it without all these fancy terms. And that's where the value debates come. Like really like so it's very important who are the experts in this facilitation thing. And you point out that it could be also that you could do done in this manipulative way, like, well, we just give you some of this info and stuff. So I think there's also like needed to be some maybe healthy disagreement among the experts as well that are chosen for these panels. That's just my thinking. And then they're just the kind of people who can actually communicate the kind of complex science and other value things to the people. I think people are much smarter than in average that we give them credit for. I think it's just like, it's the kind of situations and the kind of settings we are making those decisions, it just makes us feel stupid and kind of powerless, but I don't think we are.
Yeah, one more question.
Okay, hi. I had a thing with like part of your objections for the self-interest approach was that you can't go from like an individual's interest to the collective. Mm-hmm. But like I don't see why the fact that everyone has to like partake in their own self-interest, but since everyone has to care about their own self-interest, like to an extent it's going to tend towards some sort of like aggregate interest. Like everyone's playing game theory with each other, and if they care about only their self-interest, they're not gaining a lot. But if they care about some level of collective self-interest, they do gain a lot. And if they don't care about it, they do lose a lot as well. So I don't see why it like wouldn't tend towards aggregate self-interest anyways.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I actually agree with you. I think that, but the key there is that you care about kind of, you said some sort of collective self-interest, right? Yeah. So my point is only, so I think I agree with you. My point is only that if you want to take it from the individual level, so this is like an example from economics where your self-interest works, right? Given by my colleague Emraf Adianat. So you're in a supermarket, and then you have these queues in the supermarket, and you're looking at, everybody wants to get out of the supermarket, So I'm just looking at the queues. What's the shortest queue? Okay, I'm going to go to that queue, stand there so I can get out of here with my shopping. And then everybody who's there with their food baskets, they do the same. They're only thinking about my own, like, I want to get out with my groceries and get cooking. And that works, right? Everybody comes from their own self-interest. And then when we get like kind of stable queues at the supermarket, all the queues kind of pull equally well, Otherwise, we could have like just one till and everybody standing there and nothing happening, and it would be bad for all of us. But for that, you need like perfect knowledge. You need to see all the cues. You need to see like, oh, where should I go? And there also needs to be no disruptions. They cannot be like somebody like holding up the queue because they are returning items, for example. So there is this, and that's a kind of self-interest in economic theory. So there is this thing that individuals can just from their self-interest, and then kind of collective good emerges, right? But that's quite limited because you have to have the perfect knowledge, and you also have to have no disruptions there. But what you said, that there has to be some sort of collective thing, and there's lots of game theoretical discussions about this. Yeah, if you add like this collective good, that is already one of your values, that I want to act in a way that's good for everybody, then yeah, there's much more applications than to self-interest. But then, what is that collective self-interest? You need democratic debate to decide that first, right? So then that's the whole thing. So I do think that when we come up with this like more participatory democracy, the idea is not that we're all going to lose together. I think we're all going to win together. But that's because we have like together come up with what is that collective self-interest, and we have engaged in those messy value choices and other things. Yeah.
Thank you for the excellent questions, and please join me in thanking Säde Hormio.